In the spring of 1944, the Crimean Peninsula was no longer a forward springboard for Axis operations, but an exposed enclave. Since 1941, German 17th Army, supported by Romanian formations, had used Crimea as a base for operations against the Soviet Black Sea coast and as a shield for Axis lines of communication in southern Ukraine and the Caucasus. By late 1943, Soviet offensives on the Dnieper had driven German forces out of most of right-bank Ukraine, leaving the Axis grouping in Crimea dependent on sea routes and two narrow approaches from the mainland, the Perekop Isthmus and the Sivash Lagoon. For the Soviet leadership, the continued Axis presence in Crimea presented a political and military problem. The peninsula had symbolic value as a pre-war resort region and as the site of the long 1941 to 1942 defense of Sevastopol. Strategically, German control allowed Luftwaffe and naval units to threaten Soviet shipping in the Black Sea and to interfere with operations in southern Ukraine and the Caucasus. Clearing Crimea would remove a significant Axis foothold on the Soviet southern flank and free forces for later operations toward the Balkans. On the Axis side, Berlin viewed holding Crimea as a matter of both prestige and operational necessity. The 17th Army's continued resistance was expected to tie down substantial Soviet forces and protect Romanian oil supplies and Black Sea ports. German command also hoped that, if the situation deteriorated, at least a portion of the garrison could be evacuated by sea. Romanian divisions, already worn by earlier campaigns, were nevertheless committed to the defence of key sectors, including positions near Perekop and along the Sivash shoreline. The geography of northern Crimea shaped all planning. West of the Arabat Spit, access from the mainland narrowed to a belt of land around Perekop, barely several kilometres wide, fortified with fieldworks and older defensive lines. East of this, the Sivash, known locally as the Putrid Sea, formed a complex of shallow, hypersaline lagoons and mudflats, separated from the Sea of Azov by low sandspits and islands. High salinity, soft bottom, and hydrogen sulfide deposits produced a strong odour and corroded metal. The water often barely reached a few dozen centimetres to a metre in depth, but concealed deep mud in many places. German assessments treated the Sivash as a natural barrier. The saline marshes had not been especially useful to the Wehrmacht during the 1941 advance, and staff officers now considered them unsuitable for major offensive operations. Defensive preparations, therefore, concentrated on Perekop's fortifications and on points where narrow causeways crossed firmer ground, while the Sivash was covered by strong points, artillery positions and outposts, but not by a dense, continuous system of trenches comparable to the Isthmus. Soviet planners under the 4th Ukrainian Front, commanded by General Fyodor Tolbukin, studied the same terrain with different assumptions. During the Nizhnedneprovskaya operation in autumn 1943, troops of 51st Army had already forced the Sivash, establishing a shallow bridgehead on the Crimean side and beginning pontoon crossings several kilometres long across the lagoon in November and December. These fragile links allowed limited reinforcement and supply, but remained vulnerable to storms, artillery, and Axis air attacks, and the bridgehead itself was too narrow to support a decisive offensive. Through the winter of 1943 to 1944, both sides tried to consolidate their positions. The Axis command strengthened field fortifications at Perekop and around key road junctions and airfields inside Crimea, while also preparing evacuation plans in case the front collapsed. The Soviets improved their logistics on the north shore of the Sivash, brought artillery forward, and rotated divisions through the exposed bridgehead to gain local experience in the lagoon's conditions. For front headquarters, the question was how to turn a narrow, unstable foothold into an operational tool that could outflank the main German defences. By early April 1944, the numerical balance had shifted decisively. In the wider Crimean offensive, the 4th Ukrainian Front and attached forces fielded roughly 462,000 personnel, around 560 tanks and assault guns, more than 6,000 guns and mortars, and approximately 1,200 aircraft. Opposing them, German and Romanian units in Crimea numbered about 230,000 to 255,000 men, supported by around 1,800 guns, with limited armoured reserves and air support, increasingly constrained by fuel shortages and losses elsewhere. These figures framed the coming operation. The Axis relied on fortifications and terrain, while the Soviets sought to turn numerical and material superiority into rapid, combined arms breakthroughs. For Soviet soldiers stationed on the north shore of the Sivash, the lagoon was both a physical obstacle and a daily environment. Units training and rotating through the forward areas became familiar with its sharp sulfuric smell, variable depths, and sticky mud. Improvised walkways, rafts, and small boats were used to move patrols and supplies, revealing the possibility, but also the dangers, of large-scale movement through the shallows under hostile fire. For many rank-and-file troops, the idea that entire rifle corps and supporting units might one day cross the lagoon on foot still seemed remote. Civilians in Crimea observed these developments from different vantage points. Some communities, including Crimean Tatars, Russians, Ukrainians, and others, had already experienced occupation, evacuation, or partisan warfare since 1941. The isolation of the peninsula in late 1943 brought shortages, stricter occupation policies, and intensified partisan activity in the mountains and steppe. Rumours of an impending Soviet attempt to retake Crimea circulated alongside accounts of new fortifications at Perekop and reports of artillery duels across the narrow waters of the Sivash. Against this backdrop, Soviet operational planners considered how to combine assaults on Perekop with actions across the lagoon. Their analysis rested on a key assumption. If the Sivash could be used as a route for substantial forces rather than only small detachments, it might turn what appeared to be a frontal battle into a multi-directional attack. For German and Romanian defenders, this possibility was acknowledged but ranked below the more obvious threat of a direct breakthrough at Perekop. The stage was set for an operation in which terrain once seen as impassable would become the basis for tactical surprise. In early April 1944, the command structure on both sides around the Sivash was clearly defined. On the Soviet side, the 4th Ukrainian Front, under General Fyodor Tolbukin, controlled 2nd Guards Army, 51st Army, and supporting formations, including 8th Air Army and elements of the Black Sea Fleet. Within this framework, 2nd Guards Army under General Georgy Zakharov was assigned a central role in exploiting any breach created from the Sivash sector. Opposite them, German 17th Army, commanded by General Erwin Janicki, coordinated German and Romanian divisions distributed between the Perekop Isthmus, the Sivash front, and interior defensive lines leading towards Simferopol and Sevastopol. The formal decision to launch the Crimean offensive in April followed a period of reconnaissance and staff work that had begun in late winter. Soviet aerial reconnaissance, partisan reports, and ground patrols mapped German strongpoints, artillery positions, and road networks on the Crimean side of the Sivash. At the same time, engineering units studied the lagoon itself, measuring depths, current patterns, and the consistency of the bottom at multiple points along a wide sector. Their findings identified zones where the water reached waist level for an average soldier, interspersed with deeper mud pockets and firmer sandbars. On the Axis side, staff officers continued to treat the Sivash as difficult ground, but not as a likely main avenue for a large-scale assault. German field reports described Soviet activity in the bridgehead and occasional improvements in fieldworks, but these were interpreted as preparations for local attacks, rather than for a mass crossing. Artillery and mortars were positioned to fire on known tracks and pontoon routes, and small observation posts monitored the shoreline. However, the densest concentrations of infantry, anti-tank weapons, and reserves were were still placed to meet a frontal attack at Perekop or a thrust along established causeways. As the offensive date approached, Soviet planning documents translated terrain analysis into concrete tasks for individual formations. Rifle divisions were allotted sectors of the lagoon, with specific start lines marked on the north bank. Each formation received time schedules for moving to assembly areas, transporting ammunition and heavy weapons, and coordinating with artillery units on both shores. Specialized engineer battalions were ordered to prepare improvised crossings, corduroy paths laid on fascines, lightweight bridges for guns, and rafts for machine guns and mortars. Logistics planning reflected the unusual conditions. Standard wheeled transport could not move through the lagoon. Therefore, supplies for the initial phase were redistributed into man-portable loads, small boats, and sled-like platforms that could be dragged through the brine and mud. Medical services established aid posts close to the waterline, anticipating cases of hypothermia, skin damage, and chemical irritation from prolonged exposure to the saline and sulfurous environment. Rear depots along the North Shore stockpiled rations, ammunition, and replacement equipment for units expected to fight after emerging from the crossing in a physically weakened state. For 2nd Guards Army, the opening phase meant silent concentration rather than immediate attack. In the first week of April, its rifle corps and attached units moved toward the Sivash sector mainly at night and under camouflage discipline to avoid drawing Axis attention away from Perekop. Communications units expanded field telephone networks to forward observation posts, and liaison officers were dispatched to 51st Army and to Air Force headquarters to synchronize artillery fire plans and air support for the coming operation. German and Romanian units on the opposite shore experienced these days differently. Patrols reported signs of increased movement and occasional Soviet probing attacks across the existing bridgehead, but there was no clear indication of the scale of forces assembling beyond the lagoon. The requirement to cover extensive frontages with limited infantry meant that some companies held frontline sectors stretching several kilometers, with gaps filled by fire plans rather than by continuous trenches. Reserve battalions were kept farther to the rear, near road junctions, and prepared positions intended to block penetrations that might follow any local Soviet success. Public information on both sides showed the gap between official narratives and the operational reality. In the Soviet rear, press reports highlighted earlier advances in Ukraine and suggested that Crimea would be liberated, but provided no detail on methods or timing. German broadcasts stressed continued resistance in the peninsula and the firmness of defensive positions, including references to Perekop and Sevastopol, while giving only general descriptions of the Sivash as a natural barrier. Civilian populations inside Crimea, exposed mainly to German occupation news and rumour, could only infer that a new Soviet attempt was imminent from increased military traffic, stricter curfews, and reports of intensified partisan activity. By April 8, 1944, the formal opening of the Crimean offensive was underway. Soviet artillery began systematic preparations against identified Axis positions at Perekop and in selected sectors opposite the Sivash, seeking both to damage fortifications and to mask the movement of troops and engineers to the waterline. Under this cover, elements of 2nd Guards Army and 51st Army shifted from reserve and staging zones into final assembly areas along the lagoon. For these units, the first phase of the operation did not yet consist of direct combat, but of waiting in darkness on the exposed shoreline, equipped for an advance that would begin not on dry land, but by stepping into the shallow, toxic waters of the Sivash. For the Soviet command, the spring 1944 campaign in Crimea was framed as an operational problem with clearly defined objectives and constraints. At the highest level, the Stavka Directive to 4th Ukrainian Front set three main goals: destroy the Axis grouping in Crimea, recapture key ports such as Sevastopol and Feodosia, and secure the northern Black Sea coast to support later operations toward Romania and the Balkans. Within this framework, the Sivash sector was not an isolated episode, but one of several instruments intended to unbalance German 17th Army and prevent an orderly retreat or evacuation. Inside front headquarters, planning for 2nd Guards Army focused on converting a difficult water obstacle into an advantage. Staff officers worked through operational games in which rifle corps emerging from the Sivash would strike the flank and rear of Axis positions at Perekop and in the northern Crimean steppe. The aim was to deny the German command the opportunity to fight a linear, predictable defence along the isthmus. The planned crossing routes were chosen to deliver Soviet formations onto ground from which they could advance toward key road axes leading to Jankoy and Simferopol, thereby splitting the enemy defence into separate sectors. Logistically, the plan required a sequencing of efforts that acknowledged the physical cost of the crossing. The first echelons were to consist primarily of rifle units and light weapons, with orders to secure a continuous line on the far shore and to clear immediate strongpoints. Second echelons, including heavier artillery and anti-tank guns, would follow once improvised crossings had been strengthened. Tank and self-propelled gun units were initially held back at Perekop and other approach routes, with the expectation that they would exploit any breakthrough created by infantry advancing from the Sivash bridgehead. German 17th Army headquarters approached the same terrain with different assumptions. Under instructions from Army Group A and the German High Command, its mission was to hold Crimea as long as possible, maintain access to ports for supply and potential evacuation, and deny the Soviet Union air and naval bases on the peninsula. Planning documents emphasized the defense of Perekop, the Chonga and Arabat routes, and the urban centers of northern and central Crimea. The Sivash front was integrated into these plans as a subsidiary sector to be held by a mix of German and Romanian infantry with artillery support, but not as the main focus of reserves or construction resources. Operationally, the Axis plan relied on depth and time. If Soviet forces broke through at Perekop or expanded the Sivash bridgehead, they were to be slowed by a series of prepared positions on successive lines, buying time for higher command to decide whether to reinforce the peninsula or to evacuate part of the garrison by sea. Naval planning included studies on the capacity of Black Sea ports and available shipping, but these remained contingent options rather than an approved evacuation order. The assumption that the Soviets would commit their strongest forces to direct attacks on Perekop underpinned calculations about where to allocate ammunition, engineering assets, and mobile reserves. Intelligence collection and assessment played a central role in the planning cycle on both sides. Soviet intelligence evaluated German dispositions through aerial photography, intercepted communications, and reports from partisans operating in northern Crimea. These sources indicated that German artillery and reserves were most heavily concentrated opposite Perekop and along certain road corridors, while the Sivash positions were thinner and more fragmented. From this, front headquarters inferred that a large-scale crossing at night might achieve surprise, especially if simultaneous artillery preparation and attacks elsewhere fixed Axis attention. German intelligence officers monitored Soviet preparations, but struggled to distinguish between feints and actual axes of advance. Regular reconnaissance flights and ground patrols confirmed increased Soviet activity north of both Perekop and the Sivash, as well as a build-up of artillery. However, the multiplicity of possible Soviet intentions, combined with poor visibility over the lagoon at night and the deceptive effects of camouflage, made it difficult to detect the full concentration of 2nd Guards Army near the waterline. Reports that Soviet units were practicing movements in shallow water were recorded, but did not immediately lead to a revision of the assessment that the lagoon itself was an unlikely route for massed forces. Deception and information control were therefore incorporated into Soviet planning. Artillery schedules were designed to suggest a primary focus on Perekop, and radio traffic patterns were manipulated to conceal the exact deployment of 2nd Guards Army. Movement of heavy equipment toward the Sivash was timed to coincide with periods of increased artillery fire, which masked noise and limited Axis observation. At the same time, Soviet authorities restricted public information about operations in the region, ensuring that any rumors circulating among civilians or partisans would not provide a clear picture of the intended crossing. From the civilian perspective within Crimea, these strategic calculations manifested as changes in daily conditions rather than as explicit plans. Tightened German security measures, periodic evacuations from villages near potential front lines, and the digging of new trenches and gun pits all signalled that an offensive was expected. Yet the specific idea that a large Soviet force would attempt to wade through the Sivash in waist-deep, chemically aggressive water was not part of public knowledge. It remained an internal operational concept shaped by staff work and reconnaissance and intended to transform an area long described as impassable into the axis of a flanking movement. On the night of 8th to 9th April 1944, the planned offensive translated into movement. Along a wide sector of the north shore of the Sivash, assault battalions from 2nd Guards Army and 51st Army assembled in silence. Units were divided into successive echelons. Forward groups stripped to the minimum of equipment, followed by rifle companies with light weapons, then by engineered detachments responsible for strengthening routes and clearing obstacles. The time schedule was tight. Crossing had to begin under cover of darkness and reach the far bank before dawn, exposed troops on open water and mudflats to observation and air attack. Shortly after the opening artillery preparation began to fall on identified German and Romanian positions, the first Soviet assault groups stepped into the lagoon. Soldiers advanced in files, often roped together, using poles to probe for sudden drops or deep mud patches. The brine reached knee or waist level for many, but the greater danger lay in the bottom. Areas of relatively firm sand alternated with zones where boots sank deeply and movement slowed to a crawl. The high salinity and hydrogen sulfide content irritated skin and eyes. Some soldiers wrapped cloth around their legs and hands in an attempt to reduce direct contact. Engineers followed close behind, laying bundles of brushwood, planks, and makeshift mats to stabilize frequently used segments of the route. Markers, stakes, strips of cloth, and small lamps, partially shielded from enemy view, indicated paths through the shallows and warned of particularly soft patches. Despite these measures, weapons and ammunition boxes slipped from hands or sleds and disappeared into the mud. Commanders had anticipated losses of material and issued orders prioritizing the preservation of automatic weapons and communication equipment, even at the cost of abandoning less critical loads. On the opposite shore, German and Romanian outposts initially registered the artillery fire as part of the expected Soviet preparation. Only gradually did reports arrive of unusual noises and faint silhouettes on the lagoon. Flares went up, revealing groups of men in the water at longer distances than previous patrols had attempted. Machine guns and rifles opened fire, their traces intersecting with the artillery flashes. Mortar crews adjusted onto suspected crossing routes, using pre-sighted reference points on the northern bank and any visible concentrations of movement as targets. For Soviet troops in the lagoon, enemy fire added to the effects of cold and chemical exposure. Those hit often could not be evacuated quickly. Some were dragged back along the ropes, others sank in places where the mud was too deep for comrades to maintain footing while carrying additional weight. Nevertheless, the width of the sector and the limited density of Axis positions along the shoreline meant that not all crossing points came under equally heavy fire. In some areas, defenders misjudged the main axes of advance and concentrated on tracks used earlier by reconnaissance elements, while new routes had been opened slightly to the side. Toward midnight and into the early hours of April 9th, the first Soviet assault groups reached the southern shore. Emerging from the water, they faced a narrow strip of firmer ground rising toward low defensive works. Foxholes, trench segments, and machine gun nests sited to control expected approaches from the existing bridgehead, rather than from the center of the lagoon. In several places, initial contact took the form of short-range engagements as wet, exhausted infantry attacked positions whose crews had only minutes of warning. Hand grenades, submachine guns, and light mortars were used intensively to clear the immediate line of trenches and to secure small lodgements from which following echelons could deploy. The territorial shifts during these first hours were measured in hundreds of meters, but their significance lay in the establishment of continuous footholds rather than in dramatic advances. Soviet reports from the morning of April 9th noted captured positions on a front several kilometers wide, including sections of the first trench line and individual bunkers. German accounts recorded local withdrawals to secondary positions when units found themselves outflanked by attackers who appeared from directions previously regarded as blocked by the lagoon. Morale on both sides reflected this sudden change. For Soviet soldiers who had just crossed, the act of reaching dry ground under fire after hours in saline water provided a tangible sense of progress, even as they confronted fatigue, cold, and incomplete ammunition stocks. Many units paused only briefly to reorganize before pressing on to secure small rises or road fragments needed to expand the bridgehead. Among German and Romanian defenders, surprise at the scale and direction of the attack combined with the need to restore linear coherence to their front. Company and battalion commanders called for artillery support and requested clarification from higher headquarters regarding the extent of the Soviet landings. Civilian presence near the immediate combat zone was limited, as many inhabitants of villages close to the Sivash front had been evacuated or had moved away earlier in anticipation of fighting. Those who remained farther inland experienced the opening clashes mainly through distant sounds and visual cues, prolonged artillery fire, flares over the lagoon, and the movement of columns along roads leading toward the front. Information about the nature of the Soviet advance, whether it was a renewed effort at the existing bridgehead or something different, circulated only in fragmentary form. By the end of 9 April, the clash that had begun in darkness had produced a new situation on the map. Soviet formations stood on the southern shore of the Sivash at multiple points, holding narrow but expanding bridgeheads. The initial German expectation that the lagoon would restrict large-scale movement had been challenged in practice, yet the outcome of the wider operation remained undecided. Both sides now had to adapt their plans to a battlefield in which the line of contact no longer followed only the predictable axes of Perekop and the established causeways, but now bent around a flank opened through the waterlogged, chemically aggressive terrain of the Putrid Sea. As the first daylight after the crossing came on April 9th, the situation on both shores of the Sivash entered a phase of rapid escalation. Soviet commanders ordered additional echelons from 2nd Guards Army into the lagoon, despite reports of exhaustion and equipment loss among the units that had already reached the southern bank. Rifle regiments were fed into the crossing routes in sequence, with intervals shortened to exploit the temporary disorganization of the German front. The original narrow lodgements began to expand as fresh companies arrived and pushed outward from the initial trench lines captured during the night. The crossing itself became more hazardous as traffic increased. Paths marked during the first hours were churned into deeper mud by the passage of hundreds of men and sleds. Some engineer constructions sagged under repeated loads, forcing rapid repairs under fire. Salt water and hydrogen sulfide affected metal surfaces and fabrics. Weapon mechanisms required constant cleaning, and field telephones and radios suffered from moisture. Medical reports from forward aid posts noted rising numbers of cases involving cold shock, chemical irritation of the skin, and respiratory problems among soldiers who had spent hours immersed in the brine before fighting on land. German 17th Army headquarters received a growing stream of situation reports indicating that the attack from the Sivash was not a limited probe, but a major commitment. Divisional staffs along the affected sector requested reinforcements, artillery ammunition, and air support to counter the expanding bridgehead. Janicki and his staff had to consider whether to divert reserves from the Perekop and Chongar sectors, where a Soviet offensive was also underway, or to accept the risk of a breakthrough from the lagoon flank. The need to hold key road junctions and airfields, and political instructions not to abandon Crimea, made large withdrawals difficult to authorize. Luftwaffe and Romanian Air Force units attempted to influence the battle as weather permitted. During 9 and 10 April, bombers and ground attack aircraft targeted suspected crossing points, concentrations on the north bank, and newly occupied positions on the southern shore. Soviet air units responded with fighter cover and their own attacks on German batteries and reserve assembly areas. Aircraft losses on both sides increased, and the presence of air power added another layer of danger for troops moving in the open across the lagoon and on the exposed steppe. Artillery fire intensified. Soviet guns on the northern bank and within the bridgehead delivered barrages designed to prevent German infantry from organizing systematic counterattacks. Heavy guns and rocket launchers targeted known strongpoints, while regimental mortars engaged immediate threats to the advancing rifle units. In response, German artillery shifted from pre-planned fire against the original bridgehead to improvised counter-battery missions and harassing fire along the shoreline. Ammunition stocks, already limited by the constrained supply situation in Crimea, began to decrease at a rate that concerned German logisticians. Local counterattacks were nevertheless mounted. German and Romanian infantry companies, sometimes supported by assault guns where terrain allowed, attempted to push Soviet units back toward the waterline on April 9th and 10th. In certain sectors, they retook individual trench segments or strongpoints, inflicting casualties and buying temporary relief. However, these efforts often encountered fresh Soviet units entering the fight from the rear of the bridgehead. When counter-attacking units advanced too far without coordination, they risked being exposed to enfilade fire from neighbouring Soviet positions that had already reached higher ground. Casualty figures began to reflect the intensity of the fighting and the environmental conditions. Soviet formations reported significant numbers of men incapacitated not only by wounds, but by exposure and exhaustion. Axis Medical Services documented rising admissions from frontline units engaged around the bridgehead, with patterns of fragmentation and small arms injuries typical of close combat in trench lines and open steppe. Evacuation of the wounded was complicated on both sides. For the Soviets, by the need to move men back across or around the lagoon under fire. For the Axis, by the threat of artillery and air attack on roads leading away from the front. The command challenges were not limited to the immediate battlefield. In Berlin and Bucharest, political leaders monitored the situation with concern. German high command directives continued to stress the need to hold Crimea, but they had to be reconciled with the reality of a Soviet offensive that was now attacking from multiple directions. Romanian authorities, aware of the presence of their divisions in exposed positions and of the importance of Black Sea ports to their own economy, followed developments closely through military channels. The balance between maintaining alliance commitments and preserving national forces became an implicit factor in discussions about reinforcement or evacuation. Within Crimea, the expansion of combat operations affected civilian life over an ever wider area. Villages located near roads used by German reserves experienced requisitions of transport and labour for fortification work. As Soviet artillery and aviation extended their range, some settlements came under shelling or bombing, leading to further displacement. Partisan groups, particularly in the foothills and mountains, intensified their actions in response to signs that front lines were approaching, disrupting communications and adding another variable to rear area security. By 10th April, the bridgehead south of the Sivash was no longer a narrow foothold, but a complex zone of overlapping positions, logistics routes, and artillery fire plans. Soviet staff maps showed a growing salient penetrating into the northern Crimean steppe, while German maps recorded a bend in the front that threatened the lateral connections between units defending Perekop and those holding interior lines. The initial assumption that the lagoon would function primarily as a barrier had given way to the recognition that it had become a corridor for substantial forces. This escalation of scale and complexity transformed the crossing from a risky maneuver into a central factor shaping the crisis of the northern Crimean defence. By 10 to 11 April 1944, the fighting in the Sivash sector and across northern Crimea reached its most intense phase. The Soviet plan entered full execution. Second Guards Army, having pushed substantial forces through the lagoon, now sought to transform the bridgehead into a springboard for deeper penetration. Rifle corps expanded their frontage, moved battalions onto key ridges and road segments, and brought forward more heavy weapons. Artillery units, some of them still firing from positions on the northern shore, adjusted their fire to support attacks aimed at breaking the local German defensive system into separate fragments. The integration of forces became more complex. Elements of the 51st Army continued to operate alongside the 2nd Guards Army in the Sivash sector, while other Soviet formations pressed the Perekop defences from the north. Coordinating these efforts required continuous liaison between the headquarters of 4th Ukrainian Front, 2nd Guards Army, 51st Army, and neighbouring units. Fire plans were revised to avoid overlap and to ensure that Soviet artillery and aviation struck German reserves moving laterally to counter the bridgehead. Communications officers worked to maintain lines despite the corrosive effect of salt and moisture on cables and equipment. On the German side, the situation now demanded major decisions from 17th Army. Reports from divisional sectors indicated that Soviet units emerging from the Sivash were threatening the flanks of positions originally oriented toward Perekop and Chongar. Attempts to restore a straight, continuous line encountered growing difficulties as Soviet forces seized small hills, road crossings, and local strongpoints that had been designed as rear echelons rather than as independent front positions. Janicki's staff discussed options that ranged from immediate counterattacks with available reserves to staged withdrawals to more southerly lines, but any retreat risked exposing key airfields and road hubs. The material dimension of the battle was evident in the deployment of armour and assault guns. Soviet tank and self-propelled gun units, initially held back on firmer ground, began to exploit sectors where infantry had secured routes off the lagoon and onto the steppe. Their movement was constrained by marshy patches and anti-tank ditches, but where they could advance, they posed a serious threat to German infantry companies whose anti-tank defences had been designed for frontal engagement along known axes. German assault guns and anti-tank guns responded, leading to localised engagements where control of single roads or embankments determined whether armoured units could influence the wider battle. Air power continued to shape the peak of the campaign. Soviet aircraft concentrated on interdiction of German movements, targeting columns of vehicles, artillery positions, and supply points in the rear of the northern Crimean front. German and Romanian fighters and bombers sought to disrupt Soviet concentrations near the bridgehead and to protect critical junctions. The density of sorties increased compared with earlier days of the offensive, contributing to fuel consumption and aircraft attrition that both sides had to factor into their planning for subsequent operations on the peninsula. For the soldiers at the front, these developments translated into sustained combat with minimal respite. Units that had crossed the Sivash only hours or days earlier were ordered to continue advancing, often after only short pauses for reorganization and redistribution of ammunition. The combined effects of previous immersion in hypersaline, sulphurous water, and continued physical exertion manifested in high levels of fatigue, skin damage, and increased vulnerability to illness. Commanders tried to rotate sub-units where possible, but the operational tempo and the need to maintain pressure on the German defence limited the scope for rest. German and Romanian units experienced a different but equally demanding strain. Infantry companies holding positions threatened by the expanding bridgehead faced the prospect of envelopment if they remained too long in advanced lines. Yet orders to fall back were carefully controlled and sometimes delayed by higher headquarters. The requirement to conduct counterattacks with limited reserves, often under Soviet artillery and air attack, added to the psychological and physical pressure. Communication difficulties, including damaged lines and disrupted radio nets, occasionally led to mismatches between orders and the situation on the ground. Civilian populations in the northern and central Crimean steppe increasingly found themselves within or near active combat zones. Some villages changed hands or became forward positions, with houses used as observation points, aid stations, or supply depots. Others were evacuated by German authorities as front lines approached, leading to movements of people along the same roads used by military units. Agricultural activity, already reduced by years of war, was further disrupted as fields became sites for artillery emplacements or were traversed by vehicles and marching columns. At this peak of the campaign, the connection between the Sivash crossing and the broader Crimean operation became evident in operational maps and staff assessments. The bridgehead no longer appeared as an isolated patch of territory gained under difficult conditions. It functioned as one arm of a pincer movement whose other component was the pressure exerted on Perekop and related approaches. Soviet staff documents emphasized that continued offensive action from the Sivash sector was essential to prevent German forces from concentrating solely on one axis of defense. German analyses, meanwhile, began to describe the crossing not as an anomaly, but as a central factor contributing to the strain on the northern Crimean front, forcing the reassessment of earlier assumptions about the lagoon's role in their defensive system. As the bridgehead south of the Sivash solidified, both sides entered a phase of adjustment rather than pure expansion. For Soviet forces, the first priority was to transform a fragile foothold into a sustainable base for operations. Engineer units reinforced the routes through the lagoon, adding more fascines, planks, and primitive corduroy roads. Temporary footpaths were widened to allow sleds and, in some cases, hand-dragged carts. On the southern shore, engineers began building field roads radiating from the landing zones toward higher ground, enabling the movement of artillery pieces that had been ferried across on rafts or portable bridges. Medical and logistical adaptations followed. Front and Army medical services revised their protocols to account for the specific conditions of the crossing. Units were instructed to issue dry clothing whenever possible after emergence from the water, and simple treatments were implemented for skin lesions and chemical burns caused by prolonged contact with hypersaline, sulfurous brine. Supply sections reorganized loads so that ammunition, food, and medical supplies were packed in waterproof covers, improvised from tarpaulins and rubberized fabric. Where wheeled vehicles could not yet pass, relay systems of carrying parties were formed to maintain a continuous flow from the north bank to the forward positions. Tactical practice adjusted as well. Battalion and regimental commanders learned to exploit the irregular pattern of small rises and gullies in the steppes south of the Sivash, establishing firing lines that took advantage of folds in the ground rather than relying only on previously surveyed positions. Artillery observers, some of whom had crossed the lagoon with the first waves, coordinated closely with batteries still on the northern shore, refining fire missions to support infantry in areas where the old German defensive scheme had left gaps. The experience of moving and fighting after immersion led to changes in march discipline. Shorter bounds, more frequent pauses for reorganization, and a stricter focus on preserving footwear and personal equipment. On the German and Romanian side, adaptation focused on containing and reshaping the front. Units originally positioned for a linear defense oriented toward Perekop were compelled to pivot, establishing new lateral connections to face the growing salient. Field engineers set to work laying new minefields along likely axes of Soviet advance from the bridgehead, and resighting anti-tank guns to cover improvised roads and causeways. Where time allowed, short secondary trench systems were dug to anchor flanking positions and reduce the danger of encirclement at individual strongpoints. Command adaptations included changes in the use of reserves. Instead of holding them for a single large counterattack, German divisional commanders increasingly dispersed mobile elements to plug local gaps, conduct short thrusts against exposed Soviet flanks, and delay the consolidation of the bridgehead. Assault gun detachments and infantry reserves were shifted along interior routes to respond to Soviet penetrations that appeared unpredictably on what had been the rear of earlier defensive lines. This approach aimed to preserve fighting strength while buying time for higher headquarters to decide on larger-scale withdrawals or reorientations. Information and perception also evolved. German staff officers, confronted with repeated reports of Soviet units crossing through areas once deemed impassable, updated their assessments of the Sivash. Internal memoranda began to treat the lagoon not as a fixed obstacle, but as a contested zone, with the implication that similar crossings might be attempted elsewhere under comparable conditions. Conversely, Soviet officers recorded lessons about the feasibility of moving large bodies of troops through toxic marshland under fire, noting the high material and human cost, but also the operational benefits of exploiting an assumed defensive blind spot. Morale dynamics reflected these adaptations. Among Soviet troops, the knowledge that they had crossed a lagoon long described as putrid and impassable created a sense of having overcome a specific environmental challenge, but this was tempered by ongoing fatigue, continuing exposure, and casualties. Commanders responded with practical measures, rotating companies out of the most exposed sectors when possible, distributing hot food, and bringing propaganda teams forward to explain the broader operational purpose of the effort. For many soldiers, motivation drew less from abstract goals than from the immediate need to secure more stable positions beyond the vulnerable shoreline. For German and Romanian soldiers, adaptation to the new situation involved managing expectations that had been formed over years of fighting in more conventional settings. The notion that a shallow, foul-smelling lagoon could suddenly become the axis of a major attack challenged prior assumptions about where natural barriers ended and operational possibilities began. Unit diaries and after-action reports indicated a mixture of professional acknowledgement of Soviet ingenuity and concern about being asked to hold lines that were no longer anchored on obviously defensible terrain. Officers emphasized the need for discipline, rapid entrenchment, and strict fire control to compensate for unfavorable geometry. Civilian populations also adjusted to the evolving front. Communities that found themselves in the rear of newly established Soviet positions experienced a quick shift in authority, requisitioning, and movement restrictions. Those still under German control near the threatened sectors saw increased demands for labour and transport as engineers and infantry attempted to refortify adjusted lines. Partisan groups, observing that the front had bent around the northern steppe, adapted their own activities by focusing on roads and communication nodes that had gained new importance as German units manoeuvred to meet the threat from the Sivash. These various forms of resistance and adaptation, from improvised causeways in toxic water to hastily reoriented trench lines on the steppe, did not eliminate the fundamental asymmetry created by the crossing. They did, however, influence the pace and character of subsequent operations. The ability of Soviet forces to maintain pressure from the bridgehead despite environmental and logistical strain, and of German forces to slow and complicate that advance despite a deteriorating positional framework, set the conditions for the moment when the balance between defence and attack would shift decisively. The turning point in the Sivash sector emerged over several days rather than in a single clash. Between 10 and 13 April 1944, the cumulative effect of the crossing, the expansion of the bridgehead, and the simultaneous pressure on Perekop forced both commands to reassess their positions. For 4th Ukrainian Front, Reports from Second Guards Army indicated that units advancing from the Sivash were nearing road connections leading toward Jankoy. At the same time, attacks by other Soviet formations against the Perekop defences and neighbouring sectors achieved penetrations that, while limited in depth, interfered with German plans to hold a continuous line anchored on the isthmus. Operational sketches at Soviet headquarters began to show a developing encirclement geometry. If the forces crossing the Sivash could link up with units advancing through or around Perekop, the northern Crimean groupings of German 17th Army could be split into isolated segments, complicating any staged withdrawal and threatening the loss of artillery, supply depots, and transport. The command of Second Guards Army issued orders to accelerate the push toward key junctions and to seize positions that would cut lateral routes between German formations. Rifle Corps were instructed to press forward, even at the cost of operating with temporarily stretched flanks, counting on neighbouring armies to close gaps as the offensive unfolded. Within 17th Army, the same developments appeared as a growing risk of being outflanked and cut off. Reports from divisions opposite the Sivash described Soviet units appearing on roads and ridges that had previously been used as rear areas and communication lines for positions facing Perekop. Yenneker's staff compiled these accounts alongside information from the Perekop sector itself, where Soviet pressure was increasing. The picture that emerged was of a northern front, whose anchor points were being undermined from the east. Requests to Army Group and higher headquarters for permission to withdraw to more southerly lines took on new urgency, framed not only in terms of conserving combat strength, but also of preserving the means to evacuate part of the force by sea if ordered. The timing of decisions now became critical. If German units waited too long, the growing Soviet presence between Perekop and Jankoy could sever roads needed for organised retreat. If they withdrew too early or too rapidly, they risked losing prepared positions without fully exploiting their defensive potential. Orders transmitted during this period attempted to strike a balance. Localized withdrawals to shorten the line and straighten sectors threatened by the bridgehead, combined with instructions to hold certain key points as long as possible. In practice, frontline commanders had to improvise, executing partial pullbacks under pressure while trying to maintain cohesion in mixed German and Romanian formations. From the Soviet perspective, signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance began to detect patterns consistent with adjustment and withdrawal. Columns moving southward, changes in the density of fire from known batteries, and the abandonment of some forward positions suggested that 17th Army was attempting to avoid full encirclement. In response, 4th Ukrainian Front accelerated operations aimed at turning tactical successes into operational closure, pushing mobile groups toward road hubs, directing artillery against bridges and bottlenecks, and using aviation to attack retreating transport. The forces that had crossed the Sivash moved from a primarily frontal role to one that combined pursuit with attempts to block routes of exit. For soldiers on the ground, this turning point manifested as a change in the direction and intensity of engagements. Soviet infantry that had previously fought mainly to expand the bridgehead now encountered more frequent signs of German movement away from initial positions. Abandoned foxholes, destroyed equipment left behind, and rearguard detachments tasked with delaying actions rather than holding every trench. At the same time, certain localities remained contested as German units conducted stubborn defence or counterattacks to protect columns withdrawing through their rear. The result was a pattern of sharp engagements around villages, crossroads, and embankments, interspersed with rapid advances into areas where the front had already shifted. German and Romanian troops experienced the turning point as a transition from defending fixed lines to fighting a series of delaying actions. Orders to hold particular positions until a certain time, or until relieved, reflected the need to balance resistance with movement. Some units succeeded in breaking contact and reaching new defensive zones farther south. Others became entangled in traffic jams or were overtaken by Soviet units, advancing from unexpected directions after emerging from the Sivash sector. The growing difficulty of coordinating movements across mixed national units and formations under air and artillery attack added to the sense of a situation changing faster than written orders could accommodate. For civilians, the turning point meant that front lines began to pass more rapidly through areas that had previously been on the periphery of combat. Columns of retreating Axis troops and advancing Soviet formations moved through settlements within hours of each other, or, in some cases, simultaneously. The risk of being caught between opposing forces increased, and movements of local populations became more constrained by both military requisitions and uncertainty about which authority would be present the next day. Infrastructure, such as rail lines and bridges, already important in economic terms, now became focal points for military action and therefore targets for destruction and air attack. In analytical terms, the decisive shift lay in the loss of the Perekop Line's role as the primary barrier protecting Crimea from the mainland. Once the Sivash crossing had developed into a major axis of attack, and Soviet units had begun to threaten the rear of forces tied to Perekop, the defensive value of the isthmus was reduced. The German assumption that natural obstacles and prepared fortifications would impose a predictable pattern on Soviet operations no longer held. Conversely, Soviet planners could now see that their choice to exploit inhospitable terrain had altered the balance. Instead of accepting a frontal contest against a single, fortified choke point, they had created a multi-directional pressure that German 17th Army could not fully counter without risking its cohesion and its access to the remainder of the peninsula. By mid-April 1944, the combined effect of the Sivash crossing and the pressure on Perekop made a continuous German front in northern Crimea unsustainable. As Soviet formations advancing from the bridgehead approached Jankoy from the east and north, other Soviet armies pushed through weakened defences on the isthmus. This dual advance threatened to cut German and Romanian units into separate groups and disrupt the road and rail links that connected the northern steppe positions with the rest of the peninsula. Under these conditions, 17th Army began pulling back from many forward sectors, shifting the focus of defence toward interior lines and ultimately towards Sevastopol. The withdrawal was not a single organised movement, but a series of overlapping retreats and rearguard actions. Units that had been engaged directly against the Sivash bridgehead received orders to fall back step by step, destroying supplies they could not carry and laying mines along roads and tracks. Columns of infantry, artillery, and support units moved southward under frequent Soviet air and artillery attack. Where terrain allowed, German and Romanian detachments established temporary blocking positions to slow Soviet pursuit, trading space for time in the hope of retaining a coherent core of forces that might still be evacuated by sea or used to defend Sevastopol. Soviet forces advanced along several axes. From the Sivash bridgehead, elements of 2nd Guards Army moved toward road junctions that connected northern Crimea with the central plateau. From the Perekop sector, other Soviet formations pushed south after breaching the isthmus defences. Coordination between these axes aimed to prevent German units from disengaging cleanly. When Soviet forward detachments reached or bypassed key junctions, they threatened to cut retreating columns into separate pockets. In several cases, German and Romanian units that could not move quickly enough, or that were ordered to hold specific localities, found themselves encircled and forced either to break out under heavy losses or to surrender. Cities and towns along the retreat routes experienced rapid changes in control. Jankoy, a major rail hub, fell to Soviet forces in mid-April, complicating further German movements and disrupting the flow of supplies and evacuees. Simferopol and other administrative centres in central Crimea were taken shortly afterward. In many of these places, Axis authorities had already begun evacuating personnel and selected equipment, but large quantities of materiel remained, destroyed or abandoned during the withdrawal. For civilians, this meant both the end of occupation by German and Romanian forces, and the onset of renewed Soviet control, with its own administrative and security measures. As German and Romanian units concentrated in the southwestern part of the peninsula, Sevastopol once again became the focal point of operations. The city and its surrounding fortifications, which had been captured by Axis forces in 1942 after a prolonged siege, now served as the final stronghold for 17th Army remnants. Defensive preparations accelerated, existing positions were repaired, new fieldworks constructed, and artillery redeployed to cover likely approaches from the north and east. At the same time, naval authorities organized evacuation efforts, using German, Romanian, and other Axis shipping to remove troops and equipment across the Black Sea under Soviet air and naval attack. The forces that had crossed the Sivash played a role in driving this contraction of the front. By threatening rear areas and junctions behind the original northern lines, they reduced the time available for German command to stage an orderly retreat. Soviet reports from units that had waded through the lagoon recorded continued engagement as they advanced on the steppe and later toward the approaches of Sevastopol. Many soldiers who had suffered from exposure during the crossing now took part in follow-up operations, postponing comprehensive medical treatment until their units were rotated out of the front line, or until the campaign on the peninsula concluded. Casualty and loss figures reflected the intensity and rapidity of this final phase. Axis forces in Crimea, originally numbering over 200,000 personnel, lost a significant portion of their strength in killed, wounded, and prisoners during the withdrawal and the subsequent fighting around Sevastopol. Estimates vary, but a substantial fraction of the original grouping failed to reach evacuation points or new defensive positions. Soviet forces also incurred heavy casualties in assaults against rearguards, fortified localities, and the final defences of Sevastopol, in addition to the earlier losses during the Sivash crossing itself. The exact balance of losses is difficult to reconstruct due to differences between Soviet and German reporting and the chaotic circumstances of retreat and encirclement. For civilians, the immediate aftermath of combat brought both relief from active fighting and new uncertainties. In areas formerly under German occupation, local populations saw the re-establishment of Soviet institutions and security organs. Collaboration cases, partisan activities, and behavior under occupation became subjects of investigation. Shortly after the peninsula was fully retaken, Soviet authorities implemented large-scale security measures that affected entire groups, including the deportation of many Crimean Tatars and other communities from Crimea to other regions of the Soviet Union. These actions, carried out by state organs rather than frontline units, were part of the broader post-campaign reordering of the peninsula. Environmental and material traces of the Sivash operation remained visible for some time. The lagoon's waters and surrounding marshes contained sunken equipment, improvised causeways, and remnants of field fortifications. On the steppe south of the crossing, destroyed vehicles, artillery positions, and field graves marked the routes of advance and retreat. For military analysts on both sides, these physical traces provided data for post-action studies of what had been attempted and what had succeeded or failed. By the time organised fighting in Crimea ceased in May 1944, the immediate objectives of the Crimean offensive had been achieved. Axis forces had been driven from the peninsula or destroyed, and the Soviet Union had regained control over key ports and airfields. The specific contribution of the Sivash crossing to this outcome was recognised in internal assessments and operational summaries. It had enabled a flanking movement that undermined reliance on Perekop as the main shield of Crimea, hastened the German withdrawal, and shaped the pattern of encirclements and evacuations that characterised the final weeks of the campaign on the peninsula. In the years after the war, the Sivash crossing was incorporated into broader narratives about the Crimean offensive and the liberation of the peninsula, but its specific features continued to attract attention from military analysts. Soviet operational histories highlighted the role of 4th Ukrainian Front, 2nd Guards Army, and 51st Army in overcoming a difficult water and marsh obstacle to outflank well-prepared defences. The crossing was presented as an example of how detailed reconnaissance, engineering preparation, and coordination among arms could compensate for an adversary's reliance on natural barriers and traditional defensive lines. German post-war studies, compiled by former officers for Western militaries, treated the Sivash episode as a case in which terrain considered unsuitable for major operations became a decisive axis of attack. Analysts noted that the 17th Army had correctly identified the lagoon as dangerous ground, but had underestimated the willingness of Soviet forces to accept high physical and material costs in order to exploit that danger. They emphasized that the distribution of reserves and fieldworks had been shaped by assumptions about normal avenues of advance, assumptions that were invalidated when large formations moved through waist-deep brine and mud under cover of darkness and artillery. Within Soviet doctrinal discussions, the Sivash crossing contributed to lessons on the use of unconventional routes. Staff colleges studied the operation alongside other river and lagoon crossings, comparing the preparation and execution with actions on the Dnieper, the Vistula, and in other theatres. Points of emphasis included the value of extended engineering reconnaissance, the importance of tailoring logistics to environmental conditions, and the need to integrate deception measures so that crossings achieved not only physical penetration, but also operational surprise. The crossing also served as a reminder that success in such operations created subsequent demands. Units arriving on the far bank had to be capable of immediate offensive action despite fatigue and equipment degradation. For German and Romanian veterans, the memory of the Sivash was often linked to the broader experience of the retreat from Crimea and the loss of access to the Black Sea coast. Personal accounts describe the surprise at seeing Soviet troops emerging from an area long regarded as a protective zone and the difficulty of adjusting defensive plans once the lagoon ceased to function as a reliable barrier. These recollections coexisted with other memories connected to the Crimean campaign. The earlier siege and capture of Sevastopol, years of occupation duty, and the final attempts at evacuation under air and artillery attack. Local and regional memory in Crimea reflected a combination of military and civilian perspectives. For inhabitants of settlements near the Sivash, the crossing and subsequent battles formed part of a sequence of disruptive events that included the initial Axis advance, the occupation period, partisan warfare, and the return of Soviet authorities. Monuments and commemorations focused primarily on the liberation of Crimea and Sevastopol, with the Sivash crossing referenced as one of the key operations enabling that outcome. At the same time, the post-war deportation of entire communities from the peninsula, including many Crimean Tatars, shaped how different groups could publicly remember and discuss wartime events, including those linked to the lagoon and the northern steppe. Environmental and geographical aspects of the Sivash retained significance beyond the immediate context of 1944. The putrid sea remained a distinctive feature of the region, with its shallow, saline waters and sulfuric smell, but now also carried associations with large-scale military movement and combat. Later generations of officers and researchers studying the campaign visited the area to examine surviving traces of improvised causeways, trench lines, and artillery positions. These field studies reinforced the lesson that even highly unfavorable terrain could be exploited under certain conditions, provided that planning, reconnaissance, and acceptance of physical risk were aligned. In international military literature, the Sivash crossing has often been cited as a case study in terrain exploitation and operational surprise, rather than as an independent campaign. It is discussed alongside other operations where forces chose routes that opponents considered impractical. Mountain passes, marshlands, deserts, and ice-covered waterways. Comparisons highlight both similarities: reliance on engineer units, emphasis on secrecy, increased non-combat losses, and differences, such as the chemical effects of hypersaline water on personnel and equipment in the Sivash case. Historiographical debates about the Crimean offensive, including the Sivash crossing, have focused on questions of timing, command decisions, and human cost. Some studies examine whether German headquarters could have ordered an earlier withdrawal from Crimea, reducing losses at the price of ceding the peninsula sooner. Others analyze Soviet planning, asking whether alternative combinations of frontal assaults and flanking maneuvers might have produced different casualty patterns. The crossing through toxic, waist-deep water is recognized as a choice that imposed considerable strain on the troops involved, but also as a deliberate attempt to avoid an even more prolonged and costly struggle against a single, heavily fortified isthmus. The broader military significance of the Sivash operation lies in how it reshaped the geometry of the Crimean theatre. By opening a route that bypassed the Perekop line, Soviet forces converted what might have been a predictable contest over a narrow choke point into a multi-directional offensive. This change in geometry affected not only tactical engagements, but also strategic outcomes. It shortened the time available for 17th Army to conduct an organized retreat, influenced the scale and pattern of encirclements, and contributed to the conditions under which Crimea returned to Soviet control. In retrospect, the Sivash crossing stands as an example of how perceptions of impassable terrain can structure planning and miscalculation on all sides. For the Soviet command, it demonstrated that readiness to operate under extreme environmental conditions could create opportunities against a defender anchored on conventional obstacles. For German and Romanian forces, it underscored the risk of leaving sectors only lightly fortified on the basis of prior experience rather than on continuous reassessment. For those who lived in and around Crimea, the events of April 1944 became one more layer in a complex wartime history, in which geography, military necessity and state policy intersected to shape both immediate outcomes and long-term memories of the region and its putrid sea.